Okay, here we are. Here's our first order of business. I know I said we were going to try for the 7th week for the exam. Sadly, they couldn't find the room. Apparently, the business school, who owns the exam center, wants to do businessy stuff there. I know that's you guys too, but there you are. So we got to do it the week before, October 17th, which is not right away, but it's kind of coming up. So we have to sort of get in exam mode a little bit, which I apologize to everybody, but there it is. So it's going to be in the Blackrock Exam Center. I just found this out 10 minutes before. I'll make a proper slide for it. 10 minutes before class, but I'll make a proper slide for it. But it's going to be at 6:30 p.m. It's going to last about an hour. Now what's going to happen is I'm going to write an exam, and most of you will be done in half an hour to 40 minutes. But I will let you stay all night. You can stay till midnight if you want, so time won't be an issue. But if you sort of budget yourself an hour for it, you'll have plenty of time, like if you have to arrange for a pickup or something like that. Blackrock Exam Center is, as you might guess, way the heck out in Blackrock. I know a lot of you, well, I know, you've probably seen it before. I don't know if you have. It's a giant barn out there in Blackrock at the Smurfit School. Okay? So budget yourself time to get there. If you have a class that ends at 6, you'll probably be arriving at 7 or so. So let me know that ahead of time so that I can, not freak out about you that, yeah, you're coming. You're just coming from your class, right? Those of you who have special needs or need an area separate, there's an area there separate, so everyone's coming to the same place. All right. Just to give a small preview of what's on it, it's going to be 15 multiple choice questions with no negative marking. So you should answer all the questions, even if you don't know. We'll have more details about this. Some of you guys asked for the slides to be put up ahead of time, and I just forgot. I will put up all the old slides this afternoon. So since we're coming up on exam time, it's time to get everything organized. So today I'll put up all the old slides, and I'll put up all the old exams as well, so you can see what an exam is going to look like. 15. Yeah, so very few questions. Okay. It is not intended to be a super hard exam. As you know, we didn't cover lots and lots of stuff, and we didn't cover it in super detail up till now. We're going to have a bit more before we get there, but nevertheless, it's to check whether you've been studying and to force you to study. Right, this is the idea, and to give you a run at what the final exam is going to look like later on. Any questions about this? Yeah? I think it's 35%, but it's in the first lecture. Right, there's the slides up there. I believe it's 35%, but check, right? Because that's what I'm going to do at the end, because I've forgotten. I'm going to go look at the first lecture. What did I promise you guys? That's what it's going to be. Okay. Other questions about this? I know you'll have more. Right now it's the shock, and everyone's shell-shocked for the news. I'm sorry we have to do grades at all, but there it is. It's the fact of life, so here we are. We're going to do it. Okay, we finished GDP, actually. I believe we're on page 24. Yeah, we talked about price indexes. So we know how to find the consumer price index, and in fact, we know how to find any price index. Right? The consumer price index is just how much does it cost to buy a basket of goods that a typical consumer would buy. Okay? Now, this is a bit silly because a typical consumer doesn't exist. Right? If you think about what is a typical consumer in Ireland, well, you say, well, let's take sort of the average consumer, right? So the average consumer rents a house in Dublin, rents a house in Cork, rents a house in Galway, rents a house in Athlone, because Irish people are spread all over the place. And so you're sort of looking at what's in this basket of goods, 1/10 of a house in Dublin, 1/10 of a house in Athlone, 1/10 of a house in Galway, right? And so if the prices in Dublin shoot way up for housing, that really sucks for you guys. Somebody who's going to Cork, they could care less. Right? So maybe the house prices are stable there. They don't have to pay any more. And then the prices in Dublin go way up. Our index would go up a bit, but it would be averaged out with the Galway houses. Right? So for you, our index wouldn't go up enough because you have to buy all of your housing in Dublin, which sucks. Right? And so the price of houses go way up for you. They don't go up at all for them. Say they double in oh, God help us. They double in Dublin, and they stay exactly the same in Cork, right? Well, then so the price index would go up by, like, say, 50%. That's not enough to compensate you for the extra cost of housing, but it's more than enough to compensate them. Right? So it doesn't match anybody. There's nobody who this is the right package of goods for, because it's an average consumer, and an average consumer is something that doesn't exist because everyone lives somewhere, and people have different tastes. Some people buy coffee, some people buy tea. Some people are vegetarian, and that kind of food is more important to them. Some people eat a lot of meat, and that kind of food is more important to them. All of these prices are doing different things, so it's not reflecting anyone in particular. So for this reason, they also construct other price indexes. They construct, for example, the Dublin Consumer Price Index, which is just the typical stuff that a Dublin living person would buy, which is better for us, right? That gives more information for us, but it's not perfect because there's the south side and there's the north side and there's different shops and people are still vegetarian or not vegetarian. So it's better, but it's not quite right either. They construct the Cork Price Index. They do lots of stuff like this with consumer price indexes. They also do producer price index. Like, how much does it cost to be a producer of goods, right? Because producers of goods buy different things. Labor costs would be in there. Industrial rents would be in there. Right? We don't buy any warehouse space, me and you, but firms do. Right? And so in the basket for the producer price index, they would have warehouse space in there as a thing to track, right, in that trolley. And then you just see how much that trolley costs every single year. There's the manufacturer price index, where the people that are actually manufacturing stuff. So there's a lot of industrial steel in there, right? We don't buy any industrial steel, so it's not in our price index at all, consumer price index. But manufacturers buy a lot, and so the price of industrial steel would go in there. And you can think of hundreds of these, and in fact, hundreds of these are thought of and calculated all the time. So if you look at the statistics office, you can find at least 20 or so price indexes that they keep track of on a regular basis, and other countries keep track of different ones. Just whatever you put in the trolley, constructed exactly the same way, and then seeing how much that trolley costs each and every year. Okay? Now, that's what the government keeps track of, but in fact, there's private companies that make these price indexes too. Right? Suppose you're Hewlett-Packard, and all of a sudden, you're off in California, you're living a life, you and the executives, doing executive stuff, and then you realize, oh my God, the plants in Ireland are totally screwed up. The management's ridiculous. We had to fire the entire top management. Let's send our top troubleshooting guy out to Dublin to fix the problem. Hey, fair enough. Right? These things happen. Right? Well, the guy says, hold it. Whoa. I'm living in Palo Alto. You're going to send me out there. Prices are totally different out in Ireland. And where am I going to get my caviar? Where am I going to get my champagne? How much do they cost in Dublin? And so they say, well, we've got to compensate you for the high prices of caviar and champagne in Dublin. And so they're going to give him a bonus to go out here. But how much? Should it be more or less than the bonus that they give him to go out to Japan? Look, I'm going to have to put my kids in private school. How much do private schools cost in Dublin? How much do private schools cost in Japan? Right? And you have to compensate them. So there's companies that make executive price indexes, putting in all the stuff that executives normally buy, the champagne, the caviar, the private schools, the cocaine, all that stuff. They put it all in the price index. They shop that trolley around in each and every place, and companies buy this price index from them so that they know how much to compensate their executives when they send them various places. Right? So we can come up with hundreds and indeed thousands of these price indexes. None of them will be perfect for you. You could find, for example, an executive who just doesn't snort cocaine, gave it up years ago. I don't know how he's still an executive. Anyway, he's still got the job. They never found out. And so the cocaine in the basket doesn't matter to him. Right? And he's got 12 kids. And so for that guy, the cost of private school is way more important for the guy than it is for the guy who doesn't have any kids. Right? They're never perfect for what they're doing. We're just getting a trolley that, to best of our ability, reflects something that we want to understand. So in this case, the one that we're always going to be using is going to be the consumer price index, because we're thinking a typical consumer. When all is said and done, this is what the economy's for, to make typical consumers like get stuff and make sure that they get a roof over their head and food and all that. And so we're going to look at this consumer price index as a sort of our standard price index. But there's hundreds of them, and it just depends on the question you're asking. Okay. So from this, we get inflation. And inflation is just the percentage change in the consumer price index. It could be any price index, but typically we use the consumer price index to be our measure of inflation. So the new price minus the old price divided by the new price. And that's going to give us a number like what? Well, if we sort of calculate it out, suppose CPI new is equal to 107. CPI old is equal to 100. So see, the old one is the base year. So we get 107 minus 100 divided by 100, which is equal to 7 over 100, which is equal to 0.07. Okay. And that is a 7% increase in prices. Or 7% inflation. Okay. I do this, first of all, to point out that we're going to get numbers like 0.07. You multiply them by 100 to get the inflation rate. Right? Just for those of you who are not in the know. Now you are. 7% increase in prices, and that's about more or less what we're running these days in Ireland. 7%, 8%, 9%. Depends on how you calculate it, exactly what year you use. There is, of course, this tendency, like we have numbers, let's take them out to 12 decimal places. You want to say like some 7.0263% increase in prices, which is fine. It doesn't hurt anyone, except it gives you the impression that we know more than we do, right? Because again, this basket of goods doesn't reflect anybody's actual purchases. And so 8 decimal places is a bit ridiculous. But 7-ish% is something that we can understand. Okay. That's inflation. Okay. So here's inflation in Ireland, just so you get a vague idea of the history of our lovely country. Since the 70s, in the 70s it was like 20%. And this was kind of worldwide, not worldwide literally, but loads of countries, developed countries had this. Ireland wasn't really a developed country then, but nevertheless they had the 17% inflation. They were tied in those days to the UK, and so they kind of imported UK inflation. Then it was down to 3%, 2% for quite a while. During the crisis, it dropped to negative, and then recently it shot back up along with the rest of the industrialized world. This is what we're going through. And we'll talk a bit about inflation and where it comes from and what we can do about it as we go along. One thing that we want to be careful of is that there's a difference between all the prices going up, which we call inflation, and some prices going up more than others. So we want to keep track of them. Inflation is when we get all the prices going up together, and relative price changes is when one thing goes up by more than another thing. Right? So if coffee and tea and my salary both all three double in price, I can buy exactly the same stuff that I could before, right? And I'll buy the same amount of coffee that I did before, same amount of tea, right? Because you have to remember that one of the things that goes into prices is my wages. That's the price of my labor and yours, right? And so if all the prices are going up, it's the price of everything you buy, but also the price that you get for your labor, right? And so in fact, nothing is really changing in that sense if all the prices go up together. Okay? And the difference, of course, is if we have relative, what happened there? Okay. Relative price changes, suppose all the prices went up except my labor. Well then, I'm getting paid less in real terms, right? All the prices went up, but I'm getting the same wage I got before, I can afford less stuff. Okay? Also, if the price of coffee goes way up, and the price of tea doesn't, that's a relative price change, and I am likely to substitute away from coffee towards tea, and that's going to change my behavior. Right? So inflation per se doesn't necessarily change people's behavior, although it can. We'll talk later about how it can. But relative price changes definitely change behavior. Right? And we are going to mostly in this class be thinking about inflation, literal inflation, where all the prices go up together. Not that relative price changes aren't important. They're super important. They tend to be a bit more of a microeconomic story. So we're going to be focusing on inflation per se as more of a macroeconomic story. But of course, this distinction between macroeconomics and microeconomics is just something that's in our head. And in fact, everything's both micro and macro at the same time. So really, we should be talking about relative price changes as well. But it's a short class. We can't do everything. We're leaving the relative price changes behind mostly for this class and talking about pure inflation, where all the prices go up together, mostly. Okay, now we have an important distinction, and this is nominal versus real values. Okay. And this is a bit of jargon, right? It's a bit of jargon, but it's going to be important jargon for us. Nominal is going to be measured in euros. If anything is ever measured in the number of euros it costs or the number of euros you get, that is a nominal value. Just how many euros was the thing. Okay? But real values are measured in stuff, right? So if we think, what is my nominal wage? Well, I'm getting 20 euros an hour. What is my real wage is going to be, I can afford 5 donuts for every hour that I work, measured in stuff. How much stuff can I buy with the amount that I work, right? Whereas the nominal wage is how much money do I get, right? And in the end, we're going to think that we don't really care about money so much. We care about what the money can buy us. So we're going to be a lot more concerned about real values measured in terms of stuff than we are going to be concerned about nominal values measured in euros. Okay? So we have to have some kind of way to go between nominal values and real values. For example, we calculated GDP, which just turned out in the end to be the price of things times the amount that we produced. So it's a euro value. Right? We produced 500 cars. Each car was worth 10,000. We have, 5 million euros worth of stuff produced. So GDP is measured in euro. GDP is a nominal value, right? Which means that when this year it's 5 million, next year it's 10 million, we don't know whether that nominal value went up because we're producing more stuff or because prices went up, right? And so we need some way to go back to how much stuff did we produce? Now, if it was just cars that we produced, that would be easy. You divide through by the price of cars. But of course, it's not. It's all kinds of stuff. And so we go back to the same thing about what stuff is important and what stuff isn't important, right? So what we're going to do is we are going to go between nominal values and real values, we're going to divide by the price of stuff. And remember, our consumer price index is just the price of a trolley of goods. That's how much, put a bunch of stuff in the trolley, and then we said, how much does that stuff cost? And then we played around with it to get it sort of on a 100 scale. But it's really just the price of that trolley of goods, right? And so if I said, I get paid 20 euros an hour, and donuts cost 5 euros each, then we would say, I can afford 4 donuts for every hour I work. Right? I took my 20 euros I get paid per hour, I divided it by the price of a donut, 5 euros each, and that gave me 4 donuts that I could buy with an hour of work. Right? We do that very naturally. We don't even think about it. We are going to do exactly the same thing when we're looking at these aggregates. We're going to say, here's how much money there is. Let's divide through by the price of things, and that'll tell me how many things I can buy with that money. Right? It's simple. Right? So much money, price of donuts, number of donuts. Okay? But instead of dividing through by the price of donuts, we are going to divide through by this consumer price index, because the price index is just the price of a trolley of goods. And so the question we're asking now is, how many trolleys of goods can I buy with the money that was produced? Okay. So I'm just going to divide through by any nominal value, any euro value, by the price of trolleys of goods, and that's going to tell me how many trolleys of goods that I can buy with that money. Okay. This is super simple. It is not, by the way, we're going to use this for our calculation of real GDP, right? So in particular, we're going to be wondering, GDP went up this year. Is that because prices went up, or is that because we're actually producing more stuff, right? So we want to get it from this value of goods and services into how many trolleys of goods and services did we produce. Now, when they really do this, They use a different price index called the GDP deflator, which is the one weird one. There's hundreds of price indexes. The GDP deflator is a bit weird and is calculated in a different way. Don't worry about that, but it's a thing that's trying to reflect what we're producing rather than what we're consuming. So it's a thing. It's of no real importance for us here. Everything else in the world, we always use the most things in the world, we use the consumer price index. And we're going to use the consumer price index here as well. So what we're going to be saying is we produce enough stuff that we can trade it for 500 trolleys worth of goods. Right? And then we can compare. This year we could buy 500 trolleys of goods. Last year we could buy 400 trolleys of goods. We can buy more trolleys of goods now than we could before. So we're measuring it in terms of stuff that we might want to buy rather than measuring it in terms of euros, which is how it comes out naturally. So we're very much more concerned with real GDP than we are with nominal GDP. And that's true of everything. We're almost always more concerned with real values, your real wage, how much can you buy with what you get paid, than we are with how many euros you get when you get paid. So we're almost always concerned with the real values. And to get the real values, you get your wage, say you get 20,000 euros, we divide through by the price index, and that gives us an idea how many trolleys worth of consumer goods you can buy. Okay? It's not literally that, but when we're comparing it across years, we can treat it that way. Right? Because it's not literally that because we did all that trickery to turn it into the CPI into something out of 100 rather than just whatever it costs to buy that trolley of goods. Okay? But if the real value of your wage goes up, it means you can buy more trolleys of goods now than you could before. And if it goes down, it means that you could buy less trolleys of goods now than you did before. Okay. Just nominal value divided by the price index, number of trolleys of goods. People with me here? All right. Speeding on by this, but okay. And now we're going to talk about inflation and interest rates. Interest rates are going to be of interest to us as we go along. And the reason for that is that interest rates are going to be something that firms care a lot about when they're deciding how much to invest. Okay. Yeah. Get rid of this. Okay, what do we got? So the nominal interest rate is if I loan you money, how much do I get back in the end? So if I loan you 100 euros, how much do I get back? Right? What is the percentage change in the amount of euros that I have? The real interest rate is going to be if I loan you enough stuff, right? If I take some stuff, sell it, loan you the money, you pay me back, how much stuff can I buy at the end? Right? Which is going to be related. Now, nominal interest rate is what you'll see posted at the bank, right? If you go and you buy a car, right? You're borrowing money to buy a car, and they say it's 10% interest rate. That means at the end of the year, you have to pay back what you borrowed plus 10% more. Okay? And all of this is in terms of euros. So every interest rate that you and I ever see is always a nominal interest rate. They're loaning you money, euros, and you're paying back in euros. And they're quoting the interest rate in terms of euros. So everything's in terms of euros, so it's a nominal value. Just like anything else, we are going to be much more concerned about the real cost of things. So we're going to be wondering, if I borrow enough to buy a car now, at the end of the term, how many cars do I have to pay back? I'm going to have to pay back in cash, obviously, but is that enough to buy one car? Is that enough to buy two cars? How many cars am I sacrificing in the future? So in terms of real stuff rather than in terms of euros. Okay. So the formula that you're going to memorize, God help you don't, but well, I suppose it's okay. Like, is this one? That the real interest rate, R, is equal to the nominal interest rate minus the rate of inflation. Now we're introducing the letter pi as the rate of inflation. Anyone who took macroeconomics knows that pi is for profits, but it's not in macro. In macro, pi is for inflation. And screw those microeconomists, they can't pick our letters for us. So I is the interest rate that you would see posted at the bank. We're going to loan you 10% interest for your car. Inflation rate is something that sort of happens afterwards, and then the real interest rate is the difference between the two. Okay. more or less. You'll see the approximation thing, and I'm going to go through why that's an approximation in just a minute. Now, it turns out this real interest rate is super important. Like if we look at the early 2000s, 2002, 3, 4, 5, and we look across Europe, everybody had the same nominal interest rate. Why? Because we're in the euro area, right? And it's going to turn out that the Central Bank of Europe, which is the European Central Bank, and you don't know what a central bank is yet, you will, but they are able to pretty much make sure that everybody has more or less the same interest rate across the entire euro area. Okay? It's not a law, but they can influence the market so that that is true. So everybody across the euro area had the same interest rate. And the European Central Bank was doing that because their main area of concern was the central bit of Europe, right? Those Germany and France. Right? And they wanted to make sure that they had the right interest rate for those big areas. But inflation was different across different parts of Europe. Right? For example, Ireland was booming, so loads of money was coming in here, and inflation was high in Ireland. And inflation was high in Italy, inflation was high in Spain, inflation was high in Greece, inflation was high in Portugal. And it was low in Germany and France. Okay? So what this meant, if we look at that, we have this interest rate set for Germany and France, an inflation rate set for Germany and France that was low. So the real interest rate was something, say this was 5% and this was 2%. So we have the real interest rate of about 3% for Germany and France, which meant that in Germany and France, we're doing this in terms of real stuff, if you buy a house, right, if you borrow money, you buy a building, right? You're borrowing enough money to buy one building. At the end of the year, you have to pay back enough money to buy 1.03 buildings. You have to pay back more than what you borrowed, which is sort of natural, right? If you borrow money, you know you're paying back more than you borrowed, and that's kind of normal. And it's true in terms of stuff there as well. Okay? But if you look at Ireland or any of the other periphery countries, we had interest rate was the same 5%, but inflation rate was 6% or 7%. Okay? For all these countries, because we had our higher inflation rate, which meant that our real interest rate was negative, -2%, -1%. So what does that mean? That means if I borrow enough money to buy a house, say 200,000 euros, buy enough money to buy a house, sit in the house for a year, the house will go up by more than the amount that I have to pay. So at the end, I have to pay 210,000, but my house has gone up in value to 250,000. So now I can buy a house, sit in the house for a year, just sit there. And then at the end of the year, I can sell the house, and I have money left over, right? Because I'm paying back less in real terms than the interest rate, than the inflation rate. So even if house prices stayed the same, like relative prices stayed the same, and they were just going up with inflation, I could borrow money, buy the house, sit in the house, and sell it for more than I owed. Well, and this was true across the periphery of Europe. And it may not be a shock to you that if this is the deal. If we have these negative real interest rates, that it becomes very attractive to buy a building. Right? You buy a building, you use it for a year, maybe you rent it to somebody, maybe you stay in it yourself, and at the end of the year, you got more cash than when you started. Plus, you get the rent. So this is great. And so everybody, their brother, their cousin, their dog was buying property in Ireland. Now, it was a little different in each and every country, but in all of the countries that we had negative real interest rates, we saw huge booms in various forms of borrowing. Right? People were borrowing lots. In Greece, it was the government who was borrowing lots. In Portugal, Spain, it was the government, and they were putting it into weird things like airports in the middle of nowhere and stuff. In Ireland, everyone was buying a house. But everyone was borrowing because the real cost of borrowing was negative. They were basically paying you to borrow. If you borrowed, bought something real, and then sold that real thing a year later. Okay? And so all of these countries over-borrowed, and then when the crash happened, of course, they want the money back. Now, nobody talks about the countries that over-lent, right? Everyone who's over-borrowing is also matched by someone who's over-lending, and that, by the way, is Deutsche Bank, who was over-lending and got into huge trouble, but all covered up. Okay? So this real interest rate is really important. Like if it becomes negative, and it does from time to time, then it is incentivizing you to borrow. And people will, maybe not you personally, but loads of people will, because it's free money, right? You buy something, you sit on it for a year, you sell it, you got more money than you need to pay off, right? So it's just a free way to sort of print money, which leads to over-borrowing. Okay? So real interest rate is going to be super important. Yeah, it has been super important, and will again. So this is an approximation, so I want to show you where the approximation comes from. I want to do it for two reasons. One, I talked about real interest rates, and I said some stuff, and I suspect that for a lot of you, you're not real clear what a real interest rate is at the moment. So by making it precise, maybe it's another way of saying it, so maybe you'll be clearer on what real interest rate is. Secondly, you guys are going into commerce, and this is something that actually is a big deal. Like it's a big deal for investors, it's a big deal for example, bond traders and stuff. And people memorize this little approximation and they tattoo it on their forehead and they make tons of money knowing this. They honestly do. Tons of money. And then they get transferred from the developed country desk where they're doing developed country bonds, then they go to a developing country bonds, and all of a sudden they start losing lots of money. And they're doing that because this formula is not going to work for a lot of developing countries where it works just fine for developed countries. So we need to see why. Right? When is it a good approximation? When is it a bad approximation? This is the formula we're going to be using for this class, but it's useful to know when it applies and when it doesn't apply. Okay? Okay, so okay, so if I borrow money, euros, say I borrow €1, I pay back 1 plus I at the end of the year, right? Because that's the definition of the interest rate. That is, if you borrow 100,000 euros, you're buying a fancy car, I'm telling you. You borrow 100,000 euros. At the end of the year, you have to pay back the 100,000 euros, plus you have to pay back some interest, right? Okay. So that's the nominal interest rate. It's the definition of the nominal interest rate. And now we want to do the same thing in terms of stuff. So I'm going to borrow enough to buy one thing. Now, what is a thing? It's going to be a consumer basket, trolley full of goods, that mythical trolley we've been talking about, right? So I'm going to have PT is price today. PT plus 1 in a year. And R, of course, is the real interest rate. So I am going to borrow enough money so that I could buy one thing, okay, one trolley full of goods. So how much money do I have to borrow? Well, I borrow PT. Right. If the trolley costs 100 euros, I need to borrow 100 euros to buy one trolley full of goods. Okay. Then I borrow that money. What do I have to pay back at the end of the year? Well, I have to pay back whatever I borrowed. Go back to black. Times 1 plus I. So this is euros to pay back at end. Right? That's the number of euros I have to pay back at the end. That's fine, but that's not really what we're interested in. We're saying how much stuff do I have to forego to pay back those euros? So how many trolleys worth of goods do I have to give up at the end to pay back my loan? Okay. And well, I take this amount of money and I divide through by the price of goods. If I had to pay back 20 euros and a donut was 5 euros, then I would have to pay back enough to buy 4 donuts, right? 20 divided by the 5, divided by the price. So all I have to do now is I have to divide through by the price. And that's going to be 1 plus the real interest rate. Right, so how many baskets of goods do I have to give up? And that's the question. If I borrow enough to buy 1 basket of goods, how many baskets of goods do I have to give up a year from now? Okay? And that's the definition of the real interest rate. Okay? So this is exact. This is just by definition, this is what it looks like. Okay? Now, I'm going to want to play around with this. And I want to convert it to something that looks like our little thing. So our little thing, if you'll remember from our last page, was R is approximately equal to I minus the inflation rate. So I want to get it into some form like that. And we can see we have I floating around here. We got R floating around here, but we don't have inflation floating around here. We just got these PTs. So what I want to do is I want to convert this into something where I can see the rate of inflation. Right? And we know that the rate of inflation, by definition, is equal to PT plus 1 minus PT over PT. Right? The new price level minus the old price level divided by the old price level. So what I want to do is I want to convert these PTs into something that looks like inflation so that I can compare this with my thing. Right? And now I have an equation, and the beautiful thing about an equation is we can do any math thing we like. We can do anything we like on this equation, and it's fine. As long as we follow the rules of math, it's fine. So I'm going to manipulate this thing until I see what I'm looking for, which is the inflation rate. Okay? Now, the easiest way to do this is to take the natural log of both sides. But I know a lot of you are going to freak out if I take the natural log of both sides, so I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do it the hard way, the algebra way, which is equally valid. And actually gives you a bit more insight. So we're going to do that. Okay, so I'm going to rewrite this first equation. And what I'm going to do is find my notes so I don't screw it up. My old advisor, there's 2 rules to teaching and life. Talk low, talk slow, don't say too much. Stolen from Michael Caine. And the second one is never ever do algebra in public, which I think is good advice and instead being good advice. So we're gonna do algebra in public, but let's see how it goes. Okay, so what I'm going to start with is I'm going to divide through by 1 plus I, because I know my inflation is just about prices. And on the left-hand side here, I got a bunch of prices, but I also got a 1 plus I there. And that's going to muck up my work. So I just want prices all by themselves on one side of the equation and everything else on the other side, just so I can just look at prices separately. So my first thing I'm going to do is divide through by 1 plus I. So I get, what do I get? I get PT over PT plus 1 is equal to 1 plus R over 1 plus I. And just dividing through by 1 plus I. And then, remember my inflation is PT plus 1 minus PT divided by PT. It's a little flipped over here. So I'm gonna multiply both sides of this thing by PT plus 1, divide through by PT. I'm just gonna cross multiply this whole thing so I get PT plus 1 on the top and PT on the bottom, because here I see PT on the bottom, and so I want PT on the bottom. So I'm just cross multiplying everything, and I get 1 plus I over 1 plus R is equal to PT plus 1 over PT. I can do that. Well, can I? Can I do that? It really requires, to do that, I'm dividing through by 1 plus R. That can't be 0, right? So I'm assuming that R is not negative 1. Okay. Is that a reasonable assumption? Well, maybe. It can be whatever it wants. But you have to realize how out of whack the world has to be for that to be the case, right? That means that R has to be -1, which is like 100% decrease in the real prices. So it means that things are doubling, right? So it's saying that if I borrow enough money to buy a house today, then what, I have to pay back half a house next time? Loads, it's huge, it's hugely negative, right? So for normal operation of the economy, even crazy times like the early 2000s, not a problem. Like it was -1%, -2%, not -100% before, right? So this is okay. Like for most normal life, this is fine. Even for really, developed countries with really screwed up economies, not a problem, right? I think Turkey at times has had -30% real interest rates, but maybe Zimbabwe at some point, I don't know, but things have to be really, really screwed up before that's a problem. But we have to be careful, right? Dividing through by PT is not a problem because that's the price of a basket of goods. That's always going to have a positive price, never going to be 0. Okay, now I want to convert it into something like this. And if I sort of rewrite this just to see, this is equal to PT plus 1 over PT minus PT over PT. Right, so I can see this bit here is kind of like this bit here. So I'm in the ballpark. I just need to get this thing. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add and subtract 1 from the right-hand side. So I'm going to add 1 and subtract 1. So plus 1 minus 1, which I can do. No one can stop me. It's a free country. Do as I please. And then those 1s I am going to write in terms of, well, in particular the -1, I'm going to write in terms of PT over PT. So the whole thing becomes 1 plus I over 1 plus R equals PT plus 1 over PT minus PT over PT plus 1. Right? Just bringing this one down over here, that one down over here. And so this is 1 plus I over 1 plus R is equal to the inflation rate plus 1. And now we're talking. And so now I just want to convert it into something that we had before. And so that is going to be, I'm going to multiply both sides by 1 plus R. And so I get 1 plus I is equal to 1 plus R times 1 plus pi. Get another page. Of course, 1 plus, let me get this right. 1 plus I equals 1 plus R, 1 plus pi. Just multiply this whole miserable thing out. 1 plus I is equal to 1 times 1 is 1. 1 times pi is pi. R times 1 is R, and plus R pi. Okay, remember, where are we going? We're trying to compare this to R is approximately equal to I minus pi. So I want R on one side, so I'm going to take everything off to the other side. And so isolating R on the right-hand side, subtract 1 from both sides, I get I minus pi minus R pi is equal to R. And we want to compare these two things. Well, the difference is clearly this, right? That's the difference. So R is equal to I minus pi minus this R pi thing. Okay? Which is why that first one is an approximation. It's not exact. Everything we did so far in our algebra has been exact, right? So what is the real interest rate? It's I minus pi minus R pi. And we didn't really solve for R. We'd have to play around a little bit to solve for R. We could do that if we were so inclined. We could, I minus pi is equal to R times 1 plus pi, or R is equal to I minus pi over 1 plus pi. Right? That would also be exact, another way of writing the same thing, which is telling you, by the way, that if the inflation rate is low, this is pretty good. And if the interest rate is much different from 0, if the inflation rate is too much more than 0, it's going to be bad, right? So this approximation is a really good approximation as long as the inflation rate is really small. Right? You know, if it's 2%, 3%, 5%, even 7%, it's a pretty good approximation. I like the red one, as a way of looking at it better, even though it's not a reduced form, because we know that the real interest rate is going to be 0.02, something like that. The inflation rate is going to be 0.07, something like that. When we multiply them together, they're going to be really super small. Right? It's a little harder to tell from that second one, which is correct as well, that how far off you're going to be. Whereas the first one in red really gives you an idea, at least a ballpark figure of like how far off you're going to be. Right? 0.02 times 0.07, super close. Right? But all that's well and good until you get to really high inflation rates. Right? So you start getting really high inflation rates, then the real interest rate something like 0.5, and the inflation rate something like 1, then you're off by a lot. Which is why these things work really well for most developed countries most of the time, where the inflation rate is pretty low, but it works very, very poorly when the inflation rate gets high. Okay. Now, going forward, we are going to just be using the approximation. We're going to be perfectly happy with this. We're not going to worry about it going forward. I show you this, again, for two reasons. One, we want you to sort of know, yeah, it works fine, except when the inflation rate is really high, in which case it doesn't. And two, in there we saw the definition of the real interest rate. So that is a way for you to get a handle on what is the real interest rate. Okay. How are we doing here? All right. Okay. That's it. That is the, one second. I'm going to let you go. I should word it more carefully. Word it more carefully. That is the end of our measurement section of the class. So going forward, we're going to be in the trying to understand how the economy works portion of the class. So it's going to be into theory. The rest of the course is going to be theory, trying to come up with stories about how the economy works. Okay? Done with measurement. Okay, now you can go.